All right, big welcome to everybody. I see the participants rolling in. We'll give it a few minutes before we start. If in the meantime, for those who have already joined us, you could write a little note where you're dialing in from today in the chat to check that it works. That would be great. All right, I see some Canada, India, Latvia, Dublin, Sweden, UK. Great, we'll give it one more minute and then we will kick start. All right, I think the numbers are stabilizing a little bit. So hello to everybody, a big welcome. Welcome to those who are not new to our webinars and who have been joining us over the last year, and obviously a big welcome for those who for who it's the first time. This is the first webinar in the Navigating the ESG Reporting Landscape series, and I'm joined here by my colleague Nathan. So without further ado, let's just jump in. Quick presentation, so you know who's speaking to you today. I'm Felix. I'm the managing partner and the CEO here at Nexio Projects. And Nathan, maybe good for you to give a very quick presentation from your side.
Yeah, thanks, Felix, and good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be with you all. My name is Nathan Cable. I'm one of the senior ESG consultants here at Nexio Projects. I've been with the organization for coming up to a year now. I'm working on some of our bigger strategic projects with some of our larger clients as well, which obviously includes our reporting services. So yeah, looking forward to the webinar, and back over to you, Felix.
Super, thanks, Nathan. So just maybe house rules. There is a chat section for any technical issues. Please note some comments in there if you're having a problem hearing us, for example, or seeing the slides. There's a Q&A box as well. So this is really where we're gathering all of the questions. We're leaving 15 minutes Q&A at the end of this webinar to answer as many questions as possible. Big thanks for those who have already been sending your questions. We've received a lot. So we try to cover as much as possible today in this webinar. Last point, the slides will be shared to everybody in this webinar, as well as the recording. So you'll get access to both these things to go through them in your own time afterwards, if need be, and if that's useful. Great, so we're very thrilled to be here. Before I start and dive into the content, just a very high-level overview of Nexio and who we are. We're a consultancy, it's a sustainability consultancy based here in the Netherlands, but really working around the world with customers in more than 20 sectors and more than 25 countries. You can see on the left-hand side some of the services that we provide, but most relevant for today, we support a lot of our clients going through reporting standards and now more and more actually regulatory and mandatory reporting that is coming up. And we provide services really on a wide range of projects, from anything around decarbonization, having a climate team in-house, but also strategy development. And as I mentioned, reporting, ratings, and certifications, which is our bread and butter here at Nexio. Diving into the agenda, we have a packed agenda in 45 minutes to go through. We'll do our best. I'm noticing that I'm talking fast, but that's because I know that there's a lot to go through. But we'll start a little bit with some news around the certain standards and reporting frameworks that we deal with on a daily basis. Dive a bit deeper into three big standards, looking at GRI, looking at the ISSB, and looking at the upcoming CSRD here in Europe. So there will be a focus on these three standards, but we will touch base, of course, on various standards and frameworks as well that sort of surround these big three. And then we'll dive a little bit into preparing for what's ahead and go through some high-level case studies to make it all super practical, because that's what we love at Nexio, just being very, very practical. So, looking at what's happened the last year in review, we've obviously seen a lot of changes. We'll dive of these in more depth. The first big change, or the first big news, was the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, being really consolidating and delivering a proposal on for a baseline of sustainability disclosures. Again, voluntary disclosures, but really trying to create a global alliance around what do we need to disclose from a non-financial perspective around the world, and trying to really build that standard. So there's been a big sort of move to standardize a lot of the reporting standards that are out there. TNFD proposes a new standard around biodiversity. We'll touch only a little bit on this because it's not the big topic, but definitely something to think about, the topic of biodiversity coming on the agendas. First application of the CSRD starting in 2024 for the year 2023. Obviously, after a lot of discussions around this is actually coming into force, and we have the final document to look at. SEC proposing new rules. This is more in the US, but focused very much on climate change disclosure requirements. CDP disclosure in the US again, needed for federal suppliers. And then I will skip over the last ones, but these are other pointers which really show that we are moving towards more and more voluntary and mandatory disclosure around the world. So these are some of the trends. Facts and figures, let's just look at this a little bit. We see the G250, so the 250 biggest, largest companies in the world, and the N100 being the 100 largest companies in a sample of countries around the world. You can really see the trend of sustainability reporting going upward. The last few years flattening a little bit out, because that's where we're coming towards 96%. So most of the companies really publishing those sustainability reports really around the world. And that's what you see in the trends. GRI still being number one. So really 4 and 5 of the largest companies in the world reporting in line with GRI standards. This is still, best practice before the advent of mandatory disclosure. In the world of voluntary disclosure, GRI is still really much at the top of this. And that's why the, GRI has really been taken into these new disclosures that are being made, both at the EU, but also around the world. You can also see SASB being quite prominent here, and stock exchange guidelines, which obviously are more on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. So these not being very standardized around the world. Lastly, and this is a big trend that we want to note, is the shift from voluntary to mandatory disclosure. You can already see in Europe that in terms of reporting provisions, you see actually quite a rise of mandatory reporting provisions. Obviously, that will be accelerated by the CSRD coming into place. But the shift really from voluntary disclosure of companies towards that mandatory disclosure that is really going to be embedded in regulatory frameworks at a jurisdiction level. I will hand it over to Nathan to go into a frameworks overview. So looking, as I mentioned, at high-level picture of all of the different standards and frameworks out there, but really prioritizing a few. Nathan.
Thank you very much, Felix. Before we dive too deeply into this, I think many people on the call will probably recognize that with this real proliferation of different standards and frameworks, as Felix mentioned, there's somewhat of an alphabet soup out there at the moment with all of these different requirements and new terminologies coming in. So before we get going too much, we wanted just to give you a glossary and overview. So these will be some of the standards and frameworks we discussed today. I think many of them will be familiar to you, but yeah, just to give you a bit of insight and oversight into what we're going to discuss in a bit more depth to come. Next slide, please, Felix.
So it'd be like a little poll here for to answer. So I'm gonna launch it now. And the question is as follows: which standards or frameworks is your organization currently using in its reporting or reporting towards? Give a few minutes for everybody to respond. Great. So we're seeing, non-surprisingly, GRI sort of leading here, as well as the SDGs being quite prominent, and EcoVadis as a rating that is much used. I'll share the results. See, I still see some answers coming in. Great. I'll end the poll now. Share the results, so you should be able to see them on your screen. You can see that, again, GRI, EcoVadis, and SDGs really being up there. CDP and the UNGC a little bit less, around 30% and 17% of respondents. Great. So this gives a good insight, and Nathan, maybe some good insights for your next slides as well.
Yeah, thank you, Felix. And I think, as to be expected, some uptake of GRI in particular, and some of these other ones which are growing in popularity and scope, which we covered quite nicely on this timeline here. So in terms of chronology of reporting standards, we've seen recently a real acceleration and expansion of these different frameworks and standards of recent years, starting way back in the late 1990s with GRI as a voluntary standard, and then moving, of course, into the UNGC in the early 2000s. I think we also touched upon there that there's been a real rise as well in development in ratings and certifications, so such as CDP and EcoVadis. So for companies to provide this external validation for their sustainability efforts. So alongside reporting, we're also seeing this growing quite rapidly as well. The SDGs, which came into force in 2015, probably the preeminent and most widely recognized global sustainability standard. And of course, in recent times, we're really seeing now this shift from voluntary to mandatory reporting. So in the last couple of years, a lot of movements in the space of the ESRS, the standards which sit under the CSRD, the ISSB, in which SASB is now integrated, and also the developments with the SEC, as Felix touched upon previously. Next slide, please. So we wanted to give also go into a bit more depth and be a bit more granular with what some of these different frameworks, regulations, and standards mean. And I think it's probably an important and useful point to start with in terms of what are the differences between those. So a framework can really be seen as a set of principles or guidelines to a company. See here, such as the SDGs, we know there's 17 goals. So within those, companies are encouraged to explore and determine which ones of those are most relevant for them, and then to use those as guidelines to guide their business strategy. Standards tend to go a little bit deeper, a bit more specific and detailed criteria, and also more of an expectation on companies to be aligned and report against those. And regulations, of course, are essentially the enforcement of these standards. So a requirement for companies to report on a wide range of sustainability data, which is mandated and will become regularly more increasingly mandated as we move through this decade. Another element which is important for companies to consider is the concept of materiality. You'll see here that there's two lenses of materiality on this slide. Financial, which is the lens through which materiality has traditionally been seen. This can very much be seen as an outside-in perspective. So essentially the impact of a topic on me as a company or as a business to do business. So the impact of a topic coming in on me very much from that financial lens. There's been an increasing push, again, backed by legislation, but also by wider society, for companies to consider the principles of double materiality. And here we're really looking at the inside-out perspective. So what impact am I as a company having on the world around me? So people and planet across a range of environmental and social topics. So this double materiality perspective is being widely adopted. It's also going to be mandated under CSRD. And we're really seeing a shift in this space towards that perspective. We can go to the next slide, please. So just a brief overview of GRI. I think, as we can see from the poll, many in this webinar will be familiar or overly familiar with GRI. It's the world's most widely used standard, as Felix touched upon. Around 4 out of the 5 world's largest companies are aligned with it. You'll see a steady, actually accelerating growth in the adoption of GRI since it came into force in the late 1990s. I think what's really interesting to see here is the shift away from what was predominantly a European focus into a much more global application and use of GRI, particularly across companies based in Africa, North America, and especially Asia, as you can see in recent years, where the adoption of GRI has gone up significantly. Next slide, please. So the GRI has also got some new standards, which are updated and came into force in January this year. So companies now reporting on the GRI will have some more stricter and some deeper requirements in order to be aligned with those reporting standards. You have the universal, the sector, and the topic standards. I think it's really important to know for companies that are aligned with GRI and will continue to be under the new standards, that these standards are very much aligned and complementary with the other developments in this space. So CSRD, ISSB. If a company is reporting its GRI, you'll be very well positioned against these new requirements as well. And there's also several aspects which have become a bit more stringent or a bit more detailed within these new GRI standards, including value chain consideration. So really considering the impact of your company both up and down the value chain, and also materiality. And again, the materiality process within GRI is well aligned with these new mandated legislations which are coming in. The ISSB, as we saw in the earlier slide, the other sort of big player in the global standard space, behind GRI in terms of adoption, but also extremely widely used. Very much aims to fulfill investors' requests for high quality reporting, as you can see here. And if we go to the next slide, there's also been some interesting developments with SASB over the last couple of years. So after being founded in 2011, SASB has now been fully integrated into the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which itself sits under the IFRS Foundation. The ISSB, as Felix touched upon earlier, is in the process of developing its own sustainability disclosure standards. It currently has two standards which have been published, which are the general ones, sector agnostic standards, so looking at widely applicable sustainability topics, and also a climate proposal as well, which is well aligned with TCFD, another standard, but also includes some additional elements such as transition plans and a real focus on scope 3. So again, the focus here is really to bring greater alignment and accountability to reporting, and also to allow greater comparability for companies across the globe. One thing to note here is that in terms of materiality, for those companies which are reporting against SASB currently, SASB's current view of materiality focuses more on the financial single lens. So for those companies which will be required to report under CSRD, it's important to also consider and look into aspects such as GRI to help you with understanding these double materiality principles. And the next slide, please, Felix. So this overview, just essentially shows how the ISSB is now bedded into the IFRS Foundation. Interesting to note here that there's also the International Accounting Standards, which sit under the IFRS. And this, there's a real desire and a real want here from stakeholders for sustainability reporting to be brought to the same level of rigor and data-driven accountability as financial reporting. So the IFRS is going to be driving both these standards and really looking to raise the bar when it comes to sustainability reporting. Also to note that under CSRD, which I think is the next slide, Felix. CSRD, so one thing that's going to be really important here, as you can see on the slide, is that in a very similar way to the ISSB, the CSRD is looking to raise the bar and bring greater comparability and usability of data. So here, in a similar way in which the IFRS and ISSB is looking to bring alignment between financial and non-financial reporting, CSRD will require all sustainability data to be independently assured and verified by a third party. And that's very much in the same lens and the same ideals as financial reporting is currently. CSRD, as you can see, will also include double materiality. It will also include a requirement for data to be digitally tagged and digitally readable, which is in the XHTML format. And on the right-hand side, you can see the various different cross-cutting standards and sector-agnostic standards, which will be required for companies who are compliant under CSRD. The next slide gives a timeline, and as Felix said, practically and around practicalities, we're always very keen to make this as tangible and realistic as we can for companies. So what does this mean for you? So the first companies that will have to report on CSRD will be those which are currently compliant under the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. They will be required to report in 2025 on data in 2024. So which means from the next January onwards, data will have to be collected and ready to be reported on. Large and listed companies which are not currently under NFRD will be required to report in 2026. Listed SMEs in 2027. And non-EU companies, but those with significant activities in the EU, and there's various revenue requirements underneath this, they will also be compliant under CSRD, albeit later in this decade, so with some more time to prepare for what that means for those that currently sit outside the EU. Here we can see the companies which will fall in the CSRD scope, and this is particularly for those that are not currently under NFRD. So companies which meet 2 of these criteria will be required to report in 2026 on their 2025 data. So for those in the call whose companies apply for these, it's very important to, of course, already be preparing and to be ready for what CSRD will mean for you as a business. And I think with that, albeit somewhat of a whistle-stop tour, as we said, Felix, I'm passing back over to you for some more focus on the climate-related disclosures.
Super, thanks, Nathan. So yes, here a big overview on GRI, the coming changes to GRI, but also the ISSB, as Nathan mentioned, the changes coming there. And then finally, a quick overview at the CSRD, which obviously is applicable and relevant to the EU-based companies here on the call, but also for companies that have branches in the EU a bit further down the line. I've already seen a lot of questions around how it applies to SMEs. I hope that some of these questions have been responded to by Nathan, which will show that, you know, on this timeline, SMEs will come a little bit later in 2026. Here we're doing a little bit of a tour as well. Obviously, all three of these disclosure standards have a climate focus embedded within them. So, you know, GRI has that. ISSB is the first standard they're launching, is a climate focused standard. And CSRD obviously also has a climate pillar. But there are some other standards to be aware, and that I know some of you are already reporting to, because that's what we saw in the poll. So here, just looking at CDP. CDP in itself is a little bit like the GRI for climate in the sense that it really has had a little bit of a monopolistic spotlight over the last few years, because it was quite in advance to the others. It is the most used carbon disclosure standard. And here there's three big focuses: one on climate change, one on forest, and one on water security. The most used, however, of the three is the climate change standard, which a lot of companies have already been reporting to, and I'll show next slide how that has evolved over time. TCFD, less of a standard, more of a framework in Nathan's terminology and the definition that he has given us. But here really 11 recommendations, 4 pillars, looking at governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And here really looking at how basically the potential impacts of climate-related risks for companies. Again, very important framework that has been mandated already in the UK, as we saw on the very, very first slide, and that has fed into both the ISSB and the CSRD, as a matter of fact, really looking at the process of disclosing financial related climate risk. An important element of TCFD as well that has been taken into ISSB is this idea of scenario analysis. So really thinking about how can a company really plan for the future, look at their risks, manage those risks, and report and monitor how they're doing over time. Last one, the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBT, also called SBTI. Here, the goal of the SBTI was really to help companies, guide companies in setting standards to remain on that 1.5 degree trajectory pre-industrial, compared to pre-industrial levels. This also has been a standard that has been used more and more by companies. And companies that have been using these standards over the last few years are very well equipped, as Nathan has mentioned himself, to start reporting to both the ISSB and the CSRD. Diving very quickly into each one of these standards, CDP disclosure, here you see that actually there's been a tremendous increase in companies reporting and disclosing information to CDP. 2022 is not on this graph, I see, but there's been actually about a 38% increase from 2021 to 2022 in disclosure. So there's actually now a record-breaking, I think, more than 20,000 companies that have disclosed to the CDP. But this still means that about 30,000 companies that will need to report both to CSRD and looking at ISSB are not yet disclosing to CDP. So there's quite a gap still to be filled there. And then just looking at SBTI submissions, here again, you can see the increase over the years. And this, will continue to increase as well as jurisdictions are using both the SBT and CDP and mandating that through the new reporting standards, basically. Important to note that the SBTI has launched actually a new corporate net zero standard, not new, but it was launched in 2021. And here the standard really gives guidance, criteria, and recommendations to support decarbonization of companies and also setting those goals, right? So SBT really in a very high level perspective, 50% emissions cut by 2030 and becoming net zero by 2050 is what is being sort of the guidelines and recommendations by the Science Based Targets. So preparing for what's ahead, we've kind of compiled a little bit of a comparison. This is also some of the questions that I'm seeing arriving in the Q&A in the chat. So let us preemptively already answer some of those. Here we're looking a little bit at the similarities and differences and how you can best prepare towards these new standards that are coming up, or the evolution of existing standards. This looks very complex, but it's the easiest way or the simplest way to kind of convey how everything works together. Here you can see that both the TCFD, which we've touched upon, and the GRI really complement and influence the ISSB. And CDP also basically goes into that as well. So a little bit of a map of how these things work together. The point of this slide, if you don't remember exactly where the logos are placed and who is talking to who, is that we are definitely going to more of a global alliance on and standardization of reporting, which will arrive in the year to come. And ISSB really wants to take that role of sort of the world standard on what needs to be disclosed from a non-financial perspective. A little bit of a simpler approach to comparison here, comparing the three big standards that we've talked about and that Nathan has gone through in more detail. So GRI on the one hand, the ISSB on the other hand, and the CSRD, which is applicable in the EU. And looking a little bit at the different comparisons here. So the application, GRI and ISSB, remain voluntary and will be voluntary. The CSRD obviously mandatory, and Nathan has showed this timeline of to whom it will be applicable by when. Sectoral focus, they also have a little bit of a difference in there. GRI is actually developing those sectoral focuses, but at the moment it's still quite universal. So any company in any sector will sort of follow the same guidelines. This will evolve over time. ISSB, on the other hand, very sector specific, and CSRD both. So it will be important to look at, depending on the sector you're in, to look at what is mandated there and what you need to be disclosing. What do we mean by layered? Layered disclosures, basically, what we mean by this is for the GRI is that there's different levels where you're reporting on. So strategy, implementation, and performance. For the ISSB, also layered because you're looking at general requirements plus climate-specific standards. And in the coming years, there will be more and more standards being developed on other topics, which they've announced, for example, biodiversity, human rights. So there's also a layering of topics. And the CSRD, they're layered because we're looking at governance of companies, management of companies, but also outcomes of companies. So layered in that way. I think an important one that I'll focus on is materiality, because Nathan has mentioned this a couple of times as well. We're really looking at different types of materiality. So financial materiality for the ISSB, here still very much looking at sort of the investor lens and this outside-in perspective that Nathan has talked about. For the CSRD, we're applying this idea of double materiality. So thinking not only about the needs of investors and the risks on companies, but also taking into account, obviously, public policy objectives. So really looking at, how is the our company's climate risk, for example, linked to the net zero journey that the EU wants to embark on. Another important one is the level of assurance. The CSRD will mandate a specific level of external assurance on reports, whereas the GRI and the ISSB at the moment does not necessitate any form of sort of stamp of approval, stamp of assurance. So this will be an interesting development as well, which means that the data collection and the quality of the data will be incredibly important when reporting to the CSRD. And this will be more and more stringent as we go along. Timelines, we've shared some of that. GRI existing, you've seen also that 4 out of 5 of the biggest companies in the world are already reporting in line with the GRI standards. ISSB is still quite unclear because obviously it will also be implemented on a jurisdiction basis, so jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And a CSRD, of course, beginning of 2024 for the financial year of 2023. So it's coming very fast. 50,000 companies will fall under the CSRD compared to much less now with the current NFRD. So it's coming fast, and companies definitely who have already been reporting aligned with GRI standards, for example, and CDP are better prepared. So it's a year of preparation in 2023 to start preparing, certainly for European companies. On the topic of preparedness and how you can best prepare, we've put some tips here. We're staying quite high level. Obviously, you can't cover everything in 40 minutes. But the most important is really identifying the differences between standards and your current reporting structure. So this is super important. This is something that we do often with our clients, is this sort of a gap analysis, looking, okay, where do you stand now versus what are you going to have to report in the coming years, and how are you going to fill those gaps? And 2023 is going to be a crucial year to do so and make sure that you're already prepared for disclosure coming in 2020, beginning of 2024. Educating the organization on sustainability strategy. I think this is super important, obviously, as well, to think about not only disclosure for the sake of disclosure, but how is this aligned with the vision, with the strategy of the company, and therefore disclosure really becoming something that strengthens the strategy, making sure that you're constantly monitoring year on year how you're progressing on the different pillars and the targets that you've set for yourself. Super important, the last 2 points, I would say, very, very important to think about understanding how the information is being captured, reported on. So this is super important in terms of data quality and data management. And this is something that we see over and over again. Certainly with the advent of external assurance, incredibly important to make sure that the quality of the data is there and that it is something that is auditable. Finally, before I leave it to Nathan with some case studies and some practical examples, things to think about, big topics on the rise. We've talked about some of them, but materiality and industry-specific disclosures. This is something that will come up obviously more and more. And so it's important to go away from the more universalistic reporting standards towards more sectoral standards and data that will be very different from one sector to the other. Biodiversity, which is on the rise as well. We've seen it with GRI actually launching a new biodiversity standard in 2023. It's currently open for public comment, but it will be launched this year probably. TNFD as well being proposed, and an SBT for nature on the horizon. So they're really important for businesses to think about the impact on nature, the impact on biodiversity, something that until now has not been done a lot, certainly from a voluntary perspective. And we can imagine that that's going to be mandated as well in the coming years by different jurisdictions. Continued rise of climate disclosure, certainly on scope 3. This has been a huge topic over the last years, but will continue to be a huge topic. So for companies who have not done that yet, super important to get those ducks in a row in 2023, certainly when, if the CSRD will become applicable. And then the auditability of ESG data. This is a super important topic. So this is where the need of robust data management will be very needed in the coming years, certainly towards the CSRD, where audits will be necessary. Great. With this, we'll launch a second poll quickly to see which one of these. Let's just launch it. There we go. The topic here, sorry, there's a little bit of a mismatch between the question in the poll and the question on the slide. The question is surrounding support. So we've seen a lot of challenges. Timelines are very short, and therefore we wanted to just ask what the support is that you're looking for at the moment. What are the biggest challenges that you're facing? So we'll leave this poll on for a moment. And Nathan, you can also continue probably with the case studies quickly.
Thank you very much, Felix. Yeah, so returning to one of our key values here at Nexio Projects, which is being pragmatic. We've obviously gone through a whole wealth of information there with lots of different timelines, framework standards, etc. So we really want to bring this back and take it back a level and give some practical and pragmatic examples for a couple of trial or mock companies, and looking at how this could therefore be applicable to those with us on the webinar today, those of you who are going to be impacted by this legislation in the coming years, and some things that we can recommend to already begin preparing for that. So the first case study is for a pharmaceutical company, which is headquartered in Germany. It's publicly listed. It's got 10,000 FTEs, 3 billion euros revenue. and over 500 million in assets. So a large company with a significant footprint. And you'll see here, obviously, when we look back at the CSRD requirements, although this company in this scenario is not currently compliant under NFRD, it clearly meets all of the 3 criteria for CSRD. So what does this mean in reality then? And we can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the recommendations in the discussion here, we've broken it down into 2 core areas. Firstly, what must this company do? So you see here, this company will be required to report on its 2025 data in 2026. Therefore, it needs to be implement everything in order to be ready for that. And as Felix said, there is some lead up time to this, but you know, working with a number of different clients, companies, we realize that for many, this will be a significant ask. So things that will be required, of course, will be a double materiality assessment. So already exploring the requirements for this, what types of stakeholders will have to be engaged with, what are my material topics, how do I look to collect this data? And of course, having that first double materiality assessment completed will be a key requirement. As we've already covered a few times here, the data needs to be digitally tagged and auditable, and therefore assured by a third party as well. So what can the company do here? Well, it could also, those responsible for sustainability or internally can already begin to liaise with colleagues across legal, finance departments, or also those who are going to be responsible for data collection and management to see, is our data collection or our data collection processes up to scratch? Is our data clearly traceable and auditable? Do we have the right processes in place? Are we collecting the right data? Have we identified the KPIs, for instance, that we're going to need to report on? So already being prepared for the data requirements is going to be a real must do over the coming years. There's also a couple of things that a company could do, which will also aid it in terms of being prepared. So one is that this European company could already align its reporting with GRI, if not already doing so. As we discussed, the GRI complements the CSRD very well. And by aligning its external reporting already with GRI, the company will automatically position itself in a much stronger place, already being aware of those material topics, already having a better understanding of some of the data needs. So alignment with GRI would be highly recommended in this case. As we said as well on the previous slide, you see that this company does have a significantly large footprint, and as such is likely going to be contributing quite heavily in terms of GHG emissions. So the company could also think about being ambitious and aligning its carbon reporting and reduction strategy with some of the other standards already mentioned previously by myself and Felix. So for instance, aligning with the Science Based Targets Initiative, making sure that any target carbon reduction targets which are set are going to ensure this company is on course and maintains the trajectory towards a 1.5-degree warming scenario. TCFD could also be relevant there to help make sure that these carbon strategy and targets are as valid and as robust as they need to be in order for us as a planet to keep on that trajectory. We also touched upon a couple of the third-party validations there. So a company could also work with CDP or EcoVadis or become CDP or EcoVadis certified in order to get that external validation of its sustainability efforts, which may in turn also benefit in terms of identifying some hotspots and some areas to enhance or improve its strategy, which in turn will then contribute to the requirements under CSRD in terms of being ready to publicly disclose your data and your activities, performance, etc. once the CSRD does become fully embedded for this company. So the first one there, we wanted to touch on a large firm, which will be compliant under CSRD fairly shortly. We've also seen, of course, in the chat, I've seen a number of times questions popping up around SMEs as well. So luckily, we've also prepared an SME example here of a small dairy company which is headquartered in Ireland, also listed, albeit a much smaller company. It's got 80 full-time employees, annual revenue turnover of 30 million and 7 million in assets. So again, listed, but a much smaller company. And as you see, it does not meet those the 3 criteria, which will mean it will be required to report under CSRD in 2026. However, there will be some requirements coming into place. So the company will be required to report in 2027 on 2026 data. There is a potential and subject to opt-out until 2028 for certain companies. However, many companies in this position will be mandated and expected to report in 2027. And of course, being prepared for that is going to be key. So one thing that the company could also do here is look to align with GRI already. That's a standard recommendation we can give to any company which will or is going to be subject to CSRD in the coming years. Those European firms which can already align with GRI are going to position themselves in a much stronger place. What else could this company do? Well, they could also conduct a first or a new materiality assessment. Given that they're not going to be compliant in CSRD for a number of years, this could almost be a trial run or a first effort in order to better understand what is going to be required from a double materiality assessment. What do these principles of double materiality mean to me? How do I integrate them into my materiality? And by doing so now or imminently, the company will then give itself scope and space to potentially repeat this process, or to ensure that by the time it reaches CSRD compliance, it's fully aware of and embedded all of the necessary elements of that double materiality approach. This company could also ensure it's aware of ongoing developments around sector-specific standards. So we touched on this briefly previously, myself and Felix as well, around how both ISSB and the ESRS under CSRD are looking to develop alongside the sector-agnostic standards, which are going to be applicable widely to all companies, also some which are more specific and tailored to certain industries. So the ESRS, there is some ongoing discussions around an agriculture, farming and fishing standard, for instance. Again, very much in the early stages, nothing concrete or particularly extensive has been disclosed yet, but this company can already begin to keep itself aware and updated in terms of what sector-specific developments are happening and how they're going to affect me. So keeping an ear to ground, making sure that keeping up to date and on top of these developments will mean that once they become in place, again, the company will be much more suitably placed to be ready for that legislation. The final element that this company could also consider is that it may well sit in the supply chain or value chain of larger companies which will be compliant under CSRD at an earlier date than itself. So in this case, with more requirements around data, particularly thinking, as Felix touched upon, around scope 3, so some of the larger companies which will be required to collect and report on data from across their value chain, this company, if it sits in the supply chain of one of these larger companies, may then be subject to data requests. So already having a better grasp and understanding of your own data, even if it won't be required to report on yourself before 2027, it may well be that value chain partners and collaborators who work with your company may come to you with data requests. So already having a handle on your internal data systems, am I sufficiently collecting data? Again, have I identified the right KPIs? These are all recommended practices. And the more of these things that a company can implement now, the better position they're going to be once they do become compliant under the CSRD regulations. So with these two examples, we wanted to just, albeit with a more European focus, as we said, we wanted to just give a bit more practical and pragmatism around some real life examples of how this could look for your company and some of the recommended action points from our side. We know that the CSRD in particular, but also everything around that, is going to be a significant undertaking for many companies. So I guess a high level recommendation, I think, as Felix already emphasized, is to already begin reviewing and analyzing the processes and internal capabilities you're going to need in order to be ready to report against this. And with that, Felix, I'll pass back over to you.
Great, Nathan, thanks. I think that's really the key takeaway here, is certainly with CSRD coming along very fast, this year will really be a year of preparation. Make sure that you're ready for that. That concludes sort of the content side of the webinar. We'll go into Q&A in a moment. But before we do that, just wanted to also flag a few other webinars that are coming up. The next one actually on the same series, where we'll look at alignment and key differences of the standards. So going a little bit more in depth, what we presented in some of the last slides. We'll also be joined by one of our partners. We'll go into a practical solution to make sure that the data quality is auditable and can be assured. But we also have a sustainability goal setting workshop coming up, and how to improve CDP score webinar. So these are all aligned on the same topic, and will help you really streamline some of the efforts and prepare for what we've been mentioning. Again, the slides will be shared, so you'll get access to this. And obviously all of these webinars, I believe, are already accessible on our website as well. Let's dive into the Q&A. I'll stop sharing my screen. There we go. I've seen a bunch of questions come in. We've already started answering some of them, but we'll do our best to answer everything. I see that there's quite a lot. So without further ado, Nathan, let's tackle some of these. I see a question that around the detailed mapping of CSRD disclosure to GRI indicators. Is that something that exists? Is that something we can give advice on? I can answer that one. There is a document that actually has been made by the GRI themselves. It's accessible online. Maybe we'll make sure to we can make sure to send that your way if you cannot find it. But there is definitely a mapping. It is still with the draft version of the CSRD. So to my knowledge, there has not been a final version of this with the latest version of the CSRD, but it already gives a lot of guidance. And I think this brings us to another question, which I've seen come up here somewhere around how much in detail in terms of the pillars and the actual data that needs to be disclosed is similar between these standards. I don't know if, Nathan, if you can say a little bit more about that. You obviously had this slide on the CSRD, but maybe on the different topics, how this linked to GRI.
Yeah, and I think obviously this is a key concern that many of our clients and many of the companies on the call today, I'm sure, will have. And I think really important to note that the idea and the key aim or core goal behind this is to bring that greater alignment and comparability between the data sets across the different standards. So they are very much designed to be complementary. There is obviously some slight nuances and difference between them. They're not totally aligned, but in terms of the GRI in particular, there's a high degree of crossover between the data requirements of the GRI and, at least as Felix said, the previous draft standards of the ESRS upon which it was mapped. We've also done some work with clients, for instance, looking at SASB integration of mapping as well. And again, we do see some crossover there. So again, yeah, the core aim of these standards is ideally not to make this space ever more complicated, but to really try and bring that alignment and greater comparability, as I said. So yeah, positioning yourselves alongside these standards and those of which are contributing to the broader global development. So the ISSB and the CSRD. Yeah, GRI and SASB, again, positioning yourselves very well to be ready for those, albeit with some ongoing developments across all of those coming this year. So there will be some more, some new standards and some more data to compare and review. But yes, very much aligned to a large degree.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they're really looking at certainly the GRI and the CSRD being very aligned on the different topics. So we're looking at the typical sort of ESG buckets, environmental, social, and governance topics, and also that multi-layered approach that we talked about, also looking at governance, for example, and specific metrics. The ISSB until now has only sort of launched this general and climate standards. But as we mentioned, both Nathan and myself, they will be looking into launching more topic-specific standards in the future on biodiversity, human rights, some of these topics that they've already mentioned. And this will be coming in the coming years. So hopefully that answers that question to you, Jelko. Let's see other questions. So how should companies approach setting up software data storage, considering the very standard scope and granularity of required data? Any recommendations on good practices? I don't know if there's any recommendations from your side, Nathan, on this specifically. I'm happy to jump in.
Much more looking back in your direction for this one.
Great. Well, we actually do work with a bunch of partners, and I think this comes back as well to the point around assurance and auditability. It's going to be key to use a software where the information is going to be auditable. Nathan mentioned it, and the similarities between sort of the accounting the world accounting standards that we're following around the world, and these new standards, which will be a bit more rigorous in how the data is presented, how the data is tracked, and if the data or not is auditable. So the next webinar actually will be with our partner Position Green, which provide a software that allow us basically to help our clients manage that data and streamline that data for them. But there's a bunch of other tools that you can use out there to do so. This is a topic that we will be covering in this next webinar on February the 16th. I'm seeing in front of me. So please do make sure to join that if you want to have even more practical tips on how to do so. But definitely a huge topic around data collection and the use of software to scale basically the management of these different disclosures. Other question. Difficult question, but I'll go for it nonetheless. How have the CSRD and the German disclosures been aligned? What other differences do you expect per EU country? Don't know if you have any say on that, Nathan.
I won't pretend to be overly familiar with the German specific disclosures. But again, I think the key point, as we touched on previously, is that There's been lots of contributing factors and inputs into the developments of CSRD. So there's been lots of workshops and opportunities and periods of time in which stakeholders can input. And of course, there's also the development and input of the existing experts and standards in the space. So while not overly familiar with the German disclosures, as said before, the really core aim of this is to bring greater alignment and standardization across the EU. We could of course maybe want to explore and to loop back around on, but as I said, I would not expect there to be significant alignment differences, and of course the core aim of this is to really make this standard and comparable across different countries and different jurisdictions in the EU. Not sure if you've got anything further on that one, Felix, or
maybe the question is about the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act that has been passed last year in Germany, same as the Devoir de Vigilance in France. So we've seen some of these regulations popping up. I think the topic really is, the responsibility to report also on supplier data. And this is definitely something that has been taken into account in CSRD. This is the note we've made on scope 3 as well. This is something we're really going towards, the scope of responsibility around disclosure increasing over time. And yes, there will be some differences still at European level, but I expect that gap to be closed with CSRD coming in. That's something that will happen in the coming years for sure. Great. Question here on double materiality, a topic that you obviously touched upon, Nathan, a few times. The question here is, while it was possible with GRI as a voluntary disclosure as well to choose here the question is framed as choosing topics based on the materiality matrix and therefore defining what material topics you will be disclosing on. How will that work with CSRD? Have you seen anything around the use of materiality matrices or anything along those lines in CSRD?
This was something that I remember was reviewable and we touched upon briefly in the draft standards. So I haven't seen this or made note of this in terms of whether it's been fully formalized and implemented, but there was something within the draft standards and discussions around that this materiality assessment would be required to show companies the levels of materiality for those sector agnostic and the general standards which are expected. And I believe there was an obligation in the draft standards that if a company did not complete this double materiality assessment, they would be required to report in depth across all topics and all of those sector agnostic standards. However, there was a degree or a conversation around, again, being able to prioritize or through demonstrating through a materiality assessment, which of these are highly material and which of them are less. There was some potential for different levels of disclosure within that. But I will admit, I haven't seen whether that was adopted, changed, or formalized at all when the standards themselves were formalized, but this was definitely an element that was under discussion and part of the draft standards which were launched last year.
No, and I think it's a super interesting question because obviously what CSRD is aiming to do by being also very sector specific, the same way ISSB is basically taking over the SASB standards, there is an element of materiality already baked in the disclosures, the metrics and disclosures that they're asking sector per sector. So whereas GRI as a universalistic standard is sort of asking, hey, the same applies to everybody, but you need to do this materiality matrix or go through this materiality assessment at the beginning to define what your material topics are. And these will be the highest priority topics to disclose on. Here, they're taking a little bit of a different approach with ISSB and CSRD saying, hey, we're already baking this concept of materiality at a sector level. And there you will basically have to disclose information on these specific topics that are very prescriptive per sector and per company actually as well. This has been a big conversation, looking at the conversations that have been taking place around the CSRD. There has been chats about, okay, how do we rationalize? How do we prioritize metrics? Do we have to do everything at once? This has been a big topic of debate, and I'm sure that this will continue to be a big topic of debate. The same way that there's been a big conversation about phasing in of the standards. Seems that 2024 is around the corner. How are we going to do this? Because 2023 data starts actually as of 26 days ago for companies that have a beginning of year to end of year timeline to report on this. And then finally, how the alignment between these different standards. So these are three big topics that continuously have been debated and have been commented upon. And I think we haven't gone yet to the end of those debates. So, more to come on this probably. Let's see, we have a few minutes left, 4 minutes left. Let me see, I can choose a little bit more questions, a few more questions. A question around the different frameworks and the different concepts. So hopefully there we've answered this with, the different pillars and the answer Nathan has given. Let me see. So a good question, and I don't know if we are able to answer this as of now. Nathan, maybe you can. What does the CSRD say about groups? Is reporting on an entity necessary, or will it be at a group level? How does that work?
My understanding of the situation currently is that for those companies which are compliant under CSRD, particularly in the short term, so the large listed companies which meet 2 of the 3 criteria, they obviously will be required to report publicly against CSRD. My understanding is that for subsidiaries that make up their network or entities underneath, they're not required to report separately if the parent produces a consolidated sustainability report. But of course, part of these new, more stricter requirements, particularly around data, is going to mean that entities are going to have to contribute in terms of those data collection and validation to make sure that the full scope of a group's activities is being accurately reflected. So the short answer is the current understanding is that entities do not have to report if the parent company at the group level is compliant under CSRD, particularly in the upcoming couple of years. So those large listed companies. Yeah, that's my current understanding of the situation.
Yeah. No, so hopefully that answers a little bit your question, Eva, but I think that, there's quite some complexity around that. Obviously, and this is sort of when, as a group, you're publishing a sustainability report, you obviously are taking in the information of your entities as well and building it up the same way when reporting on your carbon footprint and including scope 3, you will have to also include emissions from your suppliers, both upstream and downstream. So there is complexity to this, but it will have to happen at the group level at the start, as Nathan says.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Let me see if I have any last questions. I'm getting a sign that we have to stop, unfortunately. 2 minutes left. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Yeah, it's a lot to take in. That's why we're also making this content available to everybody, both in the slides and the recording. Make sure to go through it. Make sure to contact us if you need any support with anything that we have mentioned. And hopefully at the end of the day, at the end of this webinar, you got a bit more clarity. And that if you didn't know, that now you do a little bit more around all of these topics. So big thanks. Nathan, I don't know if you want to close this webinar.
Yeah, no final words. Just thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Appreciate your time. And yeah, we look forward to speaking to some of you again soon.
Super. Big thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.